right, so in lecture we've just finished up talking about the filoviridae group, the Marburg, and the Ebola viruses, both very, very deadly viruses. Now we're going to move on to still enveloped, still negative sense, single-stranded RNA, which means, again, the ribosome can't recognize the RNA itself. It would have to make a template for the RNA to recognize. The only difference about this group is their RNA is segmented. So they just have one copy of it. It's still single-stranded, but it's in chunks. It's segmented RNA. And the families that we have in here, we have orthomyxoviridae group, our flu viruses, arenoviridae group, and the bunyaviridae group, which has our famous, although it's not listed on here, lacrosse encephalitis. So starting with the orthomyxoviridae group, which has lots of flu viruses in it. And then we've got our bunyaviridae as well as the arenoviridae group. Why they're usually talked together is that a lot of them infect animals, but can get transmitted to humans. Not all of them, and sometimes there are ones that are in this group that are also transmitted from animal to human via an insect like a mosquito or a tick or some other type of biting fly. But we're going to first start talking about flu viruses, all those wonderful influenza viruses that we know and love so much. So there are two types of orthomyxoviruses, type A and type B. So it's not uncommon that we'll talk about diagnosing someone with an influenza A or an influenza B. They are inhalation viruses, meaning they are all picked up airborne. They're all picked up because we breathe them in. And the main cells that these viruses attach to and cause damage to are the cells that are in our lungs. Now, why they cause so much damage is that they start attaching to the cells that line our lungs, which are epithelial cells. And those cells that initially line our lungs are there as part of our first line of defense. Because again, everything we breathe in could potentially be dangerous to us. And so our lungs are lined with a layer of epithelial cells to protect. These viruses, though, eliminate that first line of defense. They destroy those cells that line our lungs. So it's very common for people that get the flu to then suffer from another infection because they've lost that first line of defense. So if they breathe in another virus or they breathe in another bacteria, they're going to suffer. And just because we've lost that first line of defense. Now, this is one of the reasons why people do get diagnosed or get prescribed antibiotics when they have the flu, usually if they're immunocompromised. Again, an antibiotic will not help a flu patient. However, because immunocompromised individuals, they can't fight off everything, they are more prone to develop secondary bacterial infections. And so immunocompromised elderly, if they go in for the flu, it is not uncommon that they're given antibiotics. And that's just to prevent those other bacterial infections that they might pick up. And because they may be immunocompromised, worrisome on what they, that those bacterial infections are worse than the flu itself. Now, symptoms of the flu: fever, malaise or tired, headache, and myalgia, which is muscle pain. Those all come from the cytokines that are released from the immune system. They trigger all those symptoms. The one symptom or sign that's not listed that most people associate with the flu is vomiting. Vomiting is not from influenza. So if you have the flu and you're vomiting, you have something else too. You may have the flu because the flu is going to cause that tired, achy fever. But if you're also vomiting, it's probably because you picked up another bacterial infection with it. It's also worrisome, or not even worrisome, but when people talk about the flu and they talk about, I have a stomach flu. Totally different. I don't even know where it stemmed from, why they call it a stomach flu. If you are vomiting diarrhea, that's not caused by the flu. That's some other bacterial or viral issue that you picked up, and I'm not sure where the word flu got tagged with it, but unfortunately it has stuck. Influenza causes fever, tired, achy. That's what it causes. But because it damages those epithelial lining in our respiratory system, you are more likely to pick up something. So it is not uncommon to have the flu and be vomiting. It just means you're suffering from two things. Yay! Now, the structure of the influenza virus. So it has all of its genetic material is in that single-stranded RNA, the negative sense, but it has it grouped into like 8 segments. So it's like 8 little chunks of that RNA. The outside of it has 2 glycoproteins that are generally targeting the respiratory system first. And those glycoproteins, the neuraminidase and the hemagglutinin, I generally just call them NAs and HAs, are these blue and green structures, these little glycoproteins on the outside. Now, the RNA, because it is 8 little sections, has a lot of variety to it. And this particular virus is constantly mutating and constantly changing. Anytime that the genetic material changes just a little bit, the NAs and HAs change as well. So even just looking at this one has almost a ratio of like 1 blue to 3 green, 1 blue to 3 green, and then it got a little change up. But it's pretty close to 1 to 3. Well, a completely different flu strain may have a 1 to 2, or a 1 to 2 to 1 to 2, or a 1 to 3 to 1 to 4. I mean, every little bit of change changes the ratio of NAs and HAs, and that's a completely different flu strain. So it's highly variable. So we are constantly getting new strains of influenza virus. Now, there's 2 reasons why we get so many new strains of influenza virus, and I definitely recommend knowing the difference between these 2 terms, because I would expect there will be definitely one on your next exam, is antigenic drift and antigenic shift. Now, antigenic drift is the slight change. It's a slight change, a slight mutation in the genetic material, leading to a completely new strain. And I've got a picture on my next slide that can kind of show that as well. I like to envision it as it's slightly drifting along, just changing as it's drifting. Antigenic shift is when you have 2 different influenza viruses and they mix together their information. And you now get a completely different virus. So it's not just a slight change, it's a recombination of 2 different flu viruses to give you a new flu strain. So here's my difference between antigenic drift and antigenic shift. And now note, the only time flu viruses can either do drift or shift is once they get inside of a person's cells. They do not do this out in the environment. So if you get a flu virus inside your cell, someone coughed on you, you now have the flu. While that flu strain is inside of your cells, that genetic material changes just a little bit. That's a slight mutation that happens in there. And then the flu virus that leaves your cells is a slightly different strain. So green goes in, blue comes out, or teal goes in, blue comes out. That's drift. It's a slight change, but it's still a different virus. Antigenic shift is 2 different strains of flu enter the same cell at the same time. Their genetic material recombines, and what comes out is a different virus. And I like when they do the colors, red and blue goes in, what comes out is purple, because they mixed together the 2. Now, an interesting fact is antigenic shift can easily be, they can be 2 influenza A strains that go in, but it can be a human influenza A strain and an animal influenza strain. So this happens a lot when people that work in close contact with lots of animals, they can have 2 different flu strains go into the cells, recombining, get a completely different flu strain. And the interesting part is antigenic shift seems to have an outbreak about every 10 years. So going back, the bird flu was 2010. The swine flu was 2000. And this is what, since I've been teaching, I've had this diagram up. So 2010, or 2000 was the swine flu. 2000, then 2010 was the bird flu. We were due in 2020, to get a new flu strain, which was COVID. Now, COVID is slightly different. This is not a flu virus, but it's one of those, it's almost like I've been predicting that we were going to get COVID, because it seems to be about every 10 years, we do seem to have an outbreak of some kind of animal-derived virus, and coronavirus did come from an animal that changed. It just was an influenza strain. This is showing an example how you can have two different flu viruses, a duck influenza virus, that's a real thing, human influenza virus. The two viruses can go into another completely different animal. It doesn't even have to be inside of a human. And then it slightly changes. This is where we got swine flu. Like it came from two different flu strains. They recombined their genetic material, and now we've never been exposed to any of these strains, vaccine or otherwise. We've never ourselves been exposed to duck influenza, and we have no immune system. It's a completely new flu virus we have to hopefully recover from. So it's not uncommon that, yes, we've got some new strains that, can be coming from different animals. It's actually kind of crazy. If you Google stuff on CDC, how many viruses out there we are watching, because we know they exist, and we know all it takes is one slight change and we could have another possible outbreak. So here's another, this came from spring, another strain of the bird flu. They usually get, H3N8, something like, they don't get any super exciting names to them, but they're all slightly different changes. Just a slight change in their genetic material is a slightly different strain. Now, treating the flu and diagnosing the flu. Generally, diagnosis, signs, and symptoms. You've got a fever, you're tired, achy. Right there generally points to the flu. We do have tests, even little monitors that can tell us exactly if you're positive or not, and if it's the influenza A or influenza B strain. Not that it matters too much. It's still going to cause your basic flu symptoms. Treatment, we do have a couple antivirals. We have Tamiflu, it's officially known as oseltamivir, that if you're given in the first 48 hours, it does decrease how long you have the virus, because it blocks the viruses from leaving infected cells, which means they can't go in and infect other cells. So this is really only effective in the first 48 hours. After 48 hours, all those flu viruses, they've just been spread all over the body. Our best prevention is getting rid of infected birds. This is why even in this year, we had tons of chickens, why egg prices will sometimes skyrocket. We had tons of chickens that we had to kill because all it takes is one bird in amongst 1,000 on a farm that has bird flu, and they all have bird flu. And we aren't afraid of ourselves getting the bird flu. We are afraid that whatever strain is in those birds, whatever strain's in those chickens, will recombine with one of ours, and we're going to get a completely new strain that could potentially be deadly. So get rid of infected birds because they seem to be one of our biggest exposures and risks. And then we do have flu vaccines. Now, again, they are not super effective every single year. We have to look at patterns. What are we seeing? Are we starting to see more NAs and HAs on the outside of these flu strains? Where are we starting to see mutations? How are the mutations slowly starting to happen with that antigenic drift? And we tried to make our best guess. And so when you get a vaccine, it's against a whole bunch of different strains of flu viruses. And sometimes we're pretty accurate. Some years we've got a better guess on what we think is going to happen that year. And other years we are completely off, and whatever happened is not what we predicted, and the flu vaccine is not great. Now, even if the flu vaccine was not specific for whatever particular strain you got, that flu vaccine that you do get is still going to be able to recognize NAs, and is still going to be able to recognize some of the parts of a basic influenza virus. It may not recognize the exact pattern, but it's still going to have some recognition. So even if you get the flu and you've had the flu vaccine, your immune system still has a little bit of memory. It's got like a little basic recall. And so you generally suffer less severe signs and symptoms of the flu. Now, the bunya viruses are usually a lot of zoonotic diseases, so they usually affect a lot of animals, and then we don't really care about them. Our problem is that an insect, so a mosquito or a tick or a biting fly, can bite those animals, then bite us, and then spread them. Most of the viruses that are in this group are usually mild symptoms, fever, encephalitis, not always deadly, but it can cause encephalitis. Some examples, the Rift Valley fever, if you're traveling, California encephalitis, our very own La Crosse encephalitis. Again, usually not deadly, It can be, though, which is why we got a name for lacrosse encephalitis. It can be deadly, but most of them are mild flu-like type symptoms with usually a mild encephalitis. Hantavirus is a unique one because it doesn't come from a biting insect. It comes from inhaling dried mouse urine or feces. So it doesn't come from an insect. And so if you have mice in your house, it puts you at a higher risk. Luckily, we don't have a lot of cases of this because what it causes is the hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, which causes a very severe pneumonia, which can be fatal. So we don't have any treatment for it. Your best bet is limiting contact and rodent control and making sure you're not around mice if at all possible. Get yourself a cat, which has a whole nother list of issues. And then we have our RNA viruses, which we've got a couple that we're going to talk about in this group. Most of them cause hemorrhagic fevers. So they're going to cause fever as well as internal bleeding. Most of them are not anywhere in the United States, but if you travel and you are going to maybe some not so wonderful places in South America or Africa, we can pick them up from different types of animals, and it causes rodents primarily, and it causes bleeding underneath the skin as well as internal bleeding. Otherwise, they usually cause typical flu-like symptoms. There's one that's in this group, the arenaviruses, that causes lymphocytic choriomeningitis, which just sounds horrible all in itself. Flu-like symptoms. It can cause a mild meningitis, but that's about it. And the reason why it is that your immune system is a little overactive, and that inflammation happens in the meninges. So it's the your lymphocytes, your immune system causes this slight meningitis as well as flu-like symptoms. Transmitted, these are, this particular strain that causes this is transmitted by aerosols as well as some contaminated foods. And there's even one in the arenavirus that just causes the Lassa fever virus that's spread by bodily fluids. So most of them not so bad. Nothing usually too severe. But they can be spread by different methods, whether by insects and biting insects. They can be spread by aerosols, bodily fluids. Your best bet is, don't get any of them. If you are going to places that may have these viruses, is limit contact with rodents, their urine, their feces, wearing masks if you're going certain areas, making sure foods are cooked properly, and then making sure you don't have any kind of bodily fluid transition as well. Lots of good hygiene will be awesome. Now, another virus, it's in the arenavirus group. It's not spread by any kind of insect or animal. It's just spread by bodily fluids, is the hepatitis D virus, so our last hepatitis virus. It's spread usually through sexual activity or contaminated needles. The interesting part about it is that it cannot hijack host cells all on its own. It requires the hepatitis B DNA for it to actually hijack a host cell. So hepatitis D all on itself can't cause you any harm. It's only if you have hepatitis B and then get hepatitis D. The two together will cause inflammation and damage to the liver and lead to liver cancer. So what's nice is we don't have a hepatitis D vaccine, but we do have a hepatitis B vaccine. So if you can vaccinate yourself against hepatitis B, you actually are also vaccinating yourself against hepatitis D. Because getting hepatitis D in itself, it can't do what viruses do, hijack host cells. It requires the DNA that hepatitis B has. And when the two together are in the body, that is when they can cause permanent destruction to your liver. And on to our final RNA virus. It's naked, so no envelope, and it has segmented double-stranded RNA. So super unique all in itself, because RNA is always single-stranded. Everything else we talked about, single-stranded RNA, whether it's the positive or negative side, but this one has double-stranded RNA, and it's just one single family, the Reoviridae group. And in the Rioviridae group, the virus that affects humans is the rotaviruses. Now, it causes infantile gastroenteritis, so really bad diarrhea. It was usually more common in developing countries, mostly because of the poor hygiene, poor lack of sewage and clean water. So it's transmitted fecal-oral. So if you don't have good sewage control, you don't have good hygiene, fecal-oral. Luckily for us, it goes away on its own. The virus leaves with the diarrhea. I mean, that's its transmission sequence. So the treatments is replacing fluids and electrolytes because you've got diarrhea. Now, our best prevention is good hygiene as well as sewage treatment, and we now have a vaccine. It's about 75% effective, but up until a few years ago when that vaccine came out, 100% of children had picked up rotavirus at some point. So there's lots of reasons why kids and infants get diarrhea, so many things. Rotavirus was a guaranteed one of them that developed. And again, once you get into daycare settings, kids are dirty, it spread like wildfire, and everyone got it. We now have a vaccine that can prevent. So at least kids get less diarrhea in daycare settings. I was going to say this came out about a year ago, that it's still out there, and mostly because although we have a vaccine, that does not mean it's global. It's not a wide vaccine that's given, but it is becoming a vaccine that is routinely given here in the United States. So this just shows all the viruses that we talked about, at least all the families of viruses that we talked about. Lots of them. So now that you're done listening to the last little bit of this PowerPoint, you guys can take the quiz.